Does Planet 9 exist? The question arrived not as a line in a textbook or a whisper in a lecture hall, but as a signal, faint, repeating, almost alive, etched into the deep silence beyond Neptune, where even light seems to hesitate. And it was there, in the cold arithmetic of distant orbits, in the subtle trembling of objects no human eye had ever seen directly, that the idea began to take shape. Not as a theory, but as a presence, something vast and patient, moving at the edge of knowing. And the observatory, perched high above a sleeping Earth, became the place where that presence was first felt, not by touch or sound, but by deviation, by the quiet rebellion of distant bodies refusing to follow the paths they were meant to follow, drifting in synchronized defiance as if pulled by an invisible hand. And the astronomer who noticed it did not speak at first, because the data looked too clean, too intentional, like a pattern left behind by something aware, something that wanted to be noticed but not seen. And so nights turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the sky became less of a map and more of a conversation, a slow unfolding dialogue between the known and the impossible, where every new calculation brought the same conclusion dressed in different numbers. Something was out there. Something massive enough to bend the architecture of the solar system itself, yet distant enough to hide in the black beyond the reach of ordinary sight. And the deeper they looked, the stranger it became, because the predicted orbit was not chaotic or random, but precise in a way that felt deliberate, like a path chosen rather than formed. A long, elongated journey through darkness that seemed less like a natural trajectory and more like a silent patrol, circling the sun not for warmth or gravity, but for purpose. And it was then that the first images began to form, not photographs, but reconstructions, simulations of what such a planet would have to be, a giant cloaked in shadow, perhaps 10 times the mass of Earth, wrapped in an atmosphere so cold it moved like glass, reflecting almost nothing, absorbing almost everything. A world without sunrise or sunset, drifting through an eternal twilight where even the concept of day had no meaning. And yet something about it resisted the idea of lifelessness, because the disturbances it caused were too consistent, too controlled, as if the planet itself understood the forces it wielded, shaping the outer edges of the solar system with a subtlety that bordered on intention. And the astronomer began to dream of it, not in images, but in feelings, a sense of being watched from a distance so vast it erased the meaning of distance itself, a presence that did not approach but also never retreated, always there at the edge of awareness. And one night, as the instruments aligned in a configuration never before attempted, combining data from telescopes scattered across continents, something appeared. Not a clear shape, but a distortion, a bending of background stars that moved against the expected flow, slow and deliberate, like a shadow crossing a deeper shadow. And for a moment, the room fell silent, every screen glowing with the same anomaly, every calculation converging on the same impossible coordinate. And in that moment, the question changed, because it was no longer about whether Planet 9 existed, but whether it had always known it would be found. And the realization settled like frost, cold and irreversible, that perhaps this distant world was not merely part of the solar system, but a guardian of its boundaries, a silent watcher tracing a path so vast it could only be seen in fragments, influencing the orbits of forgotten objects, guiding comets like signals sent inward from the edge. And the more they analyzed the data, the clearer it became that its influence was not uniform, but selective, nudging certain bodies while leaving others untouched, as if choosing what to move and what to leave behind. And that choice implied something deeper, something that blurred the line between natural law and intention. And so the astronomer returned to the telescope again and again, not out of duty, but out of something closer to compulsion, a need to understand what could not be fully understood, to look into a darkness that seemed to look back. And as the months passed, the signal grew stronger, not in brightness but in clarity, its path becoming more defined, its presence more undeniable, until finally, one night, under a sky so clear it felt like glass, the distortion resolved just enough to suggest a boundary, a curve, the faintest outline of something immense and distant. And though no image could capture it fully, though no photograph could confirm it beyond doubt, everyone in that room knew the same thing at the same time, that the solar system was not as empty at its edges as they had once believed, that something vast and silent moved in the darkness beyond, shaping the paths of worlds without ever revealing its own, and that the question of its existence was no longer a matter of proof, but of perspective, because some things do not need to be seen to be real, and some presences are defined not by what they show, but by what they quietly change. And as the astronomer finally stepped away from the telescope, the sky above remained unchanged to the naked eye, a familiar scattering of stars over a quiet world. Yet somewhere far beyond that calm surface, something continued its slow, deliberate orbit, unseen but undeniable. A silent answer, written, not in light, but in motion.
And yet, the answer refused to stay still. Because once it had been sensed, once its quiet influence had been traced through the delicate geometry of distant orbits, it began to unfold into something far more unsettling, something that did not belong entirely to the realm of planets or physics. And the astronomer, unable to return to the simplicity of before, started to notice details that had once seemed irrelevant, small inconsistencies buried in decades of archived observations, fragments of data dismissed as noise, each one now aligning with a precision that suggested not coincidence, but continuity, as if Planet 9 had always been there, not just in space, but in the margins of human awareness, slipping through measurements, bending assumptions, waiting for the moment when understanding would catch up just enough to glimpse its outline. And as the global network of observatories turned its collective gaze toward that distant coordinate, the darkness did not yield easily. It deepened, absorbing light in a way that defied expectation, as though it were not merely a lack of illumination, but a presence that consumed it. And the simulations began to fail, their models collapsing under the weight of new variables that refused to behave. Gravity acting not as a simple force, but as something layered, almost textured, creating pockets of influence that shifted over time, subtle tides in the fabric of space itself. And within those tides, the smaller bodies moved like leaves on an invisible ocean, their paths curving in ways that suggested they were being guided rather than pulled. And the idea took hold, quietly at first, and then with growing certainty, that Planet 9 was not just a passive mass drifting through the void, but an active participant in the structure of the solar system's outer boundary, a kind of anchor or sentinel whose orbit defined a region not just of space, but of behavior, where objects either fell into its influence or were left to wander beyond it. And this boundary, once mapped, revealed something even more profound, a shape that was not perfectly elliptical or circular, but slightly asymmetrical, as if it had been adjusted, refined over time. And the astronomer found themselves staring not at a random distribution of distant objects, but at a pattern that felt almost intentional, a quiet architecture built across millions of kilometers. And the question returned, sharper now, not does Planet 9 exist, but what is it doing? And the deeper they looked, the more the answers seemed to drift just out of reach, because every time they approached a conclusion, the data shifted just enough to suggest something else, something larger. And one night, as a new set of readings came in from a remote telescope stationed in the far southern hemisphere, a change was detected, subtle but undeniable, a slight alteration in the expected motion of a cluster of trans-Neptunian objects, not a deviation from the model, but a deviation from the deviation, as if the guiding force itself had adjusted its influence. And for the first time, the room filled not with excitement, but with unease, because that kind of change implied responsiveness, and responsiveness implied awareness. And though no one said it aloud, the thought moved through them all like a shadow, that perhaps they were not the only ones observing, that perhaps the act of looking had been noticed. And the astronomer, standing at the edge of that realization, felt the vast distance between Earth and that unseen world collapse into something immediate, something present, and the sky, once a distant ceiling, began to feel like a surface that could be touched or touched back. And in the days that followed, the observations became more careful, more deliberate, as if each measurement carried weight beyond its numbers. And the data continued to arrive, steady and unrelenting, each piece reinforcing the same impossible truth, that the outer solar system was not a quiet, forgotten expanse, but a dynamic, structured region shaped by something that moved with purpose, something that existed not just as a planet, but as a presence woven into the very motion of distant worlds. And as the astronomer finally closed the last report of the night and stepped outside into the cool silence beneath the stars, the question no longer felt like a question at all, but like a threshold, something that had been crossed without fully understanding when or how. And above them, the sky remained unchanged, indifferent and infinite. Yet somewhere beyond its familiar patterns, a massive, unseen body continued its slow, deliberate journey, adjusting the paths of objects no one would ever see directly, shaping the boundary between what is known and what is not. And in that quiet motion, there was an answer, not spoken or shown, but felt, a certainty that existence is not always something that reveals itself. Sometimes it is something that waits, patient and precise, until the moment you are finally ready to realize that it has been there all along, watching the edges of your understanding expand toward it.
And the expansion did not stop, because once the edge of understanding had shifted, it continued to move outward, pulling curiosity with it like a tide that could not recede. And the astronomer began to see the solar system not as a collection of isolated worlds, but as a single interconnected structure whose outermost layer was alive with quiet influence, a boundary that responded and adapted. And in that shifting boundary, Planet 9 was no longer just an object, but a function, a role embedded in the architecture itself. And the deeper this idea settled, the more it began to change the way everything else was perceived. Because if one hidden world could shape so much without being seen, then the darkness beyond might not be empty at all, but filled with similar presences, each one tracing slow, deliberate paths through regions where light rarely reached. And the thought carried a strange weight, not of fear, but of scale. A realization that what had once seemed vast was only a fragment of something far larger and more intricate. And the instruments, now refined and recalibrated with this new perspective, began to reveal patterns that had always been there but had never been interpreted correctly. Slight alignments in the trajectories of distant comets, subtle echoes in the timing of their returns, as if they were responding not just to gravity, but to a rhythm, a cadence set by something far beyond their origin. And that rhythm led back, again and again, to the same distant path, the same unseen orbit, the same silent presence moving in a cycle so long it stretched beyond recorded history. And it was in that cycle that the astronomer found the most unsettling detail of all, a periodic shift that suggested not only motion, but phase, as if Planet 9's influence waxed and waned over time in a pattern too consistent to ignore, like a slow heartbeat pulsing at the edge of the solar system. And with each pulse, the distribution of distant objects adjusted ever so slightly, not enough to be obvious in a single lifetime, but enough to accumulate across centuries into a structure that now appeared almost designed. And the idea of design lingered in the mind longer than it should have, because it carried implications that reached far beyond physics, touching on questions that had no place in equations. And yet the data refused to dismiss it entirely, leaving just enough ambiguity to make certainty impossible and dismissal incomplete. And so the work continued, driven by a need not just to observe but to understand, to find some boundary where the known could finally separate itself from the unknown. But that boundary kept shifting, always just out of reach. And one night, as a new generation of instruments came online, capable of detecting distortions in space with unprecedented sensitivity, something unexpected emerged. Not a clearer image of Planet 9, but a faint trace of its past, a residual imprint left behind in the motion of objects that had passed near its path long ago, like footprints in a medium that should not hold them.
And by reconstructing those imprints, the astronomer was able to map not just where the planet was, but where it had been over spans of time that stretched into the distant past. And the resulting path revealed something that no one had anticipated, a gradual shift in its orbit, not random but directional, as if the entire trajectory was slowly migrating, adjusting over epochs in a way that suggested interaction with something even farther out, something beyond the already distant edge. And the implication unfolded slowly but inevitably that Planet 9 itself might not be the outermost boundary, but part of a larger system extending into regions that had never even been considered. And the sense of scale expanded once again, carrying with it a quiet, overwhelming awareness that the solar system, once thought to be a closed and comprehensible structure, was in fact open, connected to something deeper and more complex than anyone had imagined. And as the astronomer stood beneath the night sky once more, the familiar constellations now felt like markers on the surface of something vast and layered, a map that hinted at depth rather than completeness. And somewhere beyond those markers, beyond the reach of light, in the limits of observation, Planet 9 continued its silent motion, not as an isolated mystery, but part of a chain of influences stretching outward into the unknown. A reminder that every answer reveals a new question, and that existence, especially in the depths of space, is not a static fact, but a continuous unfolding, where what is hidden is not absent, but simply waiting for the moment when understanding grows enough to reach it. And in that waiting, there was no urgency, no demand, only the quiet certainty that the universe does not reveal itself all at once, but in layers, each one deeper and more profound than the last. And somewhere within those layers, far beyond the last known orbit, something continued to move with purpose, shaping the unseen edges of reality itself.
And in that, shaping the boundary between observer and observed began to blur, because the more precisely the astronomer traced the outer architecture, the more the inner patterns of human thoughts seemed to echo it, as if understanding itself followed a similar orbit, drawn towards something distant and unseen, circling and through hypotheses and revisions, never quite touching, but never escaping either. And the realization came quietly, without announcement, that the search for Planet 9 had changed from an external investigation into something almost introspective, a reflection of how far perception could stretch before it encountered its own limits. And yet, the data continued, unwavering and indifferent to philosophy, presenting new anomalies that demanded attention. And among them was a subtle shift in timing, a delay in the expected arrival of signals from probes positioned at the far reaches of the solar system, a delay so small it could have been dismissed as error, but repeated with such consistency that it became impossible to ignore. And when those delays were mapped against the projected position of Planet 9, a pattern emerged that was both precise and unsettling. The signals slowed as they passed through a region aligned with the planet's orbit, not by interference in the conventional sense, but by something deeper, as if space itself thickened there, stretching the passage of time ever so slightly. And the implication unfolded slowly, carrying with it a weight that settled into every calculation, that Planet 9 might not only influence motion, but the very medium through which motion occurred, bending not just paths but durations. And in that bending, the universe revealed another layer, one where distance and time were not fixed backdrops, but variables subject to forces that had yet to be fully understood. And the astronomer, now standing at the intersection of observation and realization, felt the quiet gravity of that truth, because it meant that the unseen world beyond Neptune was not merely distant, it was different, governed by conditions that did not fully align with those closer to the sun. And that difference extended the mystery beyond existence into nature, into the question of what Planet 9 actually was, not just in form, but in function. And as new models were constructed, incorporating these temporal distortions, the simulations began to produce shapes that were no longer purely planetary, structures of influence that extended outward like faint halos, regions where the rules of motion shifted gradually rather than abruptly, creating a gradient between the known and the unknown.
and within that gradient, objects moved with subtle hesitation, their trajectories bending not sharply but smoothly, as if guided by a field that blended gravity with something more elusive, something that resisted simple definition. And the deeper the models went, the more they suggested that Planet 9 might be less like a solitary world and more like a node in a larger network, a point where forces converged and redistributed, linking the solar system to a broader structure that extended beyond the reach of direct observation. And this idea, once formed, began to align with other unexplained phenomena, distant irregularities that had been catalogued and forgotten, each one now fitting into a pattern that hinted at connectivity rather than isolation, and the astronomer found themselves tracing lines not just through space, but through understanding, connecting fragments of knowledge into a web that grew more intricate with each discovery. And at its outermost edge, always just beyond complete clarity, the presence of Planet 9 remained constant, a quiet anchor in a sea of shifting possibilities. And one night, as the accumulated data reached a threshold where projection and observation began to converge, a moment arrived that felt less like discovery and more like recognition, when the models aligned with reality so precisely that the unseen path of the planet could be followed forward in time with unprecedented confidence. And in that projection, there was a point, far in the future, where its orbit would bring it into a position of slightly greater visibility, not enough to be seen clearly, but enough to leave a stronger imprint on the surrounding field, a moment where the boundary would thin just enough to allow a clearer glimpse of what had always been hidden. And the astronomer, standing at the edge of that prediction, understood that the search would not end with that moment, because seeing it would not answer all questions, it would only deepen them, revealing new layers of complexity that would extend the mystery even further. And yet, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the pursuit itself had meaning beyond resolution, that the act of reaching outward, of refining perception and expanding understanding, was itself part of the larger structure, a reflection of the same forces that shaped the distant edges of the solar system. And as the night deepened and the stars held their silent positions above, the question that had once begun everything no longer felt like a simple inquiry, but like an invitation, an ever-expanding field of discovery where existence is not a fixed answer, but a continuous unfolding. And somewhere within that unfolding, beyond the last visible orbit, Planet 9 continued its patient, deliberate motion, not hiding, not revealing, but simply being. A presence defined not by what it shows, but by the subtle, undeniable way it shapes everything around it.